No one in town knew what lurked behind the marble walls of that hilltop mansion, but everyone talked about the millionaire's gaze, cold and calculating, which seemed to weigh every word before uttering it. To many, he was just another rich man, bored with his own fortune. To her, a newly hired young maid, he was the embodiment of an unattainable world, until, one night of stifling silence, he entered the kitchen, placed on the table a necklace of rubies as red as fresh blood, and made a proposal. That seemed too generous to be real. The jewel's glow reflected like fire in her eyes, but what truly burned was the absurd condition that would follow, one that would change not only her life, but the entire fate of that house. She held the necklace with trembling hands, feeling the cold weight of the gold and the invisible pulse of the rubies against her skin. He didn't smile. He simply leaned in, close enough for her to smell the woody scent of his perfume, and quietly stated the condition. That would make her hesitate between fleeing or accepting. In that instant, the kitchen seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and the distant sound of the wind against the windows became a muffled echo. She knew that accepting would mean entering a dangerous game, where every step would be watched and every gesture would have a price. But refusing could cost so much more. The necklace glowed like a silent pact, and the house, as if it had heard the proposal, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. If this story has kept you hooked so far, just imagine what's to come. Like the channel and subscribe now. The autumn wind blew down the hill with a cold whisper, dragging dry leaves along the narrow road that led to the mansion. From a distance, its marble walls reflected the last light of day, as if they held within a secret the sun dared not touch. To those passing through the iron gate, the house was merely an elegant fortress, but to those who lived within, it was a silent labyrinth, where each room seemed to hide stories no one told aloud. She arrived on a grey morning, clutching a worn suitcase and the weight of debts that didn't belong to her. She had the look of someone who learned early on to keep quiet and hands accustomed to invisible work. The newspaper ad promised a high salary for domestic services, but omitted any details about the employer, and perhaps that was for the best. The first time she saw him, he was leaning against the office door, observing her with the calm of someone examining a rare painting. Tall, with sharp features and slightly graying hair, he wore an impeccable suit that contrasted with the slightly dusty surroundings. He wasn't a man of smiles. His welcome sounded almost like a warning. In the days that followed, she noticed his orders were brief, and silence prevailed in the hallways. Still, there was something about him that disconcerted her. The way he looked, as if he measured people's worth without ever revealing his judgment. At night, the mansion took on an almost spectral air. The ticking of a distant clock, the creaking of a wooden staircase, the echo of footsteps that sometimes weren't hers. She began to notice that there were rooms no one entered, and doors that never opened. In the third week, something changed. He appeared at the end of the hallway, calling her by name, not Miss or Maid, but her full name, pronounced firmly. He asked her to follow him to the dining room. On the table, a small velvet box waited, as if it had been there for hours. When she opened it, the air seemed to shift. A ruby necklace, intense and vivid, reflected the candlelight, as if it were on fire. He watched her, motionless, until he said quietly that the gift wasn't just a gift. There was a condition. It wasn't an ordinary condition, and she could tell from the way he looked at her that accepting it meant crossing a line from which there was no turning back. He didn't ask her to sit. He simply pointed to the necklace, as if placing a piece on a board and awaiting the opponent's move. He said, with the serenity of someone dictating a contract read 1,000 times, that it had belonged to his deceased wife, and that, if she accepted, she would wear it every night from 8 to midnight without exception, even on days of rain, fever, or fatigue. I would dine with him at the main table, in the seat to the left, hands visible, back straight, without asking questions, without talking about himself, without looking directly at the portrait on the opposite wall. No one outside the house was to know about the jewel. If anyone asked, I would tell them they were cheap jewelry. He would never allow anyone else to touch it, and he would never remove it from his neck inside the property. One final detail whispered like a cold knife. If a tear fell on the rubies, the agreement would instantly end, and with it, the job, the letter of recommendation, and any promise of help. That was how the absurd condition took shape. To wear a past that wasn't hers like a uniform, to occupy an unfillable void, to exist, and at the same time, to disappear. She felt her shoulders stiffen under the gravity of what was unwritten. There was no mention of affection, of smiles, of conversation. There was presence, silence, ritual. He pushed a manila envelope across the table, and she saw, between dry lines and harsh clauses, the guarantee that the debts drowning her, her mother's. Hospital bills, her sister's months of unpaid rent, would be paid off in 30 days, provided all the rules were followed. 30 nights of rubies and silence, 30 nights of haunting the table. The pen weighed more than gold as he signed. As he fastened the necklace, the housekeeper, the only witness, a woman with kind eyes named Mrs. Doyle, averted her gaze, as if afraid of waking a ghost. The icy rubies touched her collarbone, and an ancient, sweet perfume seemed to rise from the metal, as if the memory had a scent. At 8 o'clock sharp, the hallway clock chimed the hour with authority. She entered the chandelier-lit dining room, and the world shrank to a rectangle of white linen, crystal, and silver. He was already seated, his napkin folded on his lap, his gaze restrained. When she took the seat to her left, she noticed a portrait at the end of the wall, a slim, elegant woman, bare-shouldered, the same necklace shining like a red wound in the painting. Her stomach clenched. The poor. Air tasted of varnish and old dust. The meal began with a choreographed clink of cutlery. He spoke little, short sentences about the wine, the weather, the pruning of the vines on a plot of land she would never see. When his eyes inadvertently touched the portrait, he said simply, "No," without raising his voice. The word fell between them like a stone in a still lake, opening circles of embarrassment that reached her throat. She tried to concentrate on her food, but she could feel the necklace, pulsing each ruby like a small alien heart. Sometimes she thought she could smell rain, even though the sky was clear, sometimes a distant piano, even without music. The night stretched on like a long corridor. At the first intermission, Mrs. Doyle changed the plates with the delicacy of someone familiar with mourning and rules. The accidental touch of her fingertips to the chain made the housekeeper flinch, apologizing in a whisper. "It's just a necklace," she tried to say, but the sound didn't come out. He watched her as if expecting a mistake, and she, who knew how to survive stares, felt reduced to the idea of a woman she'd never met. When the clock struck 11:58, he raised his hand and for the first time smiled, a short, toothless gesture, as if the last half-hour were the narrowest margin of the ritual. She thought of the rule forbidding tears and realized the utter absurdity. Harder than staying, eating, keeping quiet, was holding back the water, someone decides. You can't spill. At midnight he rose and thanked her for her presence. The word was carefully chosen, he didn't say company. Presence. Something you notice but don't touch. As she left, she crossed the hall and, in the antique mirror, instinctively searched for her own face. The central ruby gave off an uncomfortable glow, and then she saw, on the back of the clasp, a tiny, almost imperceptible engraving. 12:11. The date of the portrait? The birthday of the woman in the painting? Hers. Her heart skipped a beat. When she turned to ask, he was gone. The house closed its eyes again, and the necklace in the darkness seemed heavier than all the secrets of that hill. In the following days, the routine took on the weight of a liturgical ritual, and each minute before 8 became a silent countdown. She spent her mornings cleaning rooms that were rarely used, and her afternoons polishing silverware that never received visitors. Whenever the sun began to set, she could feel the presence of the necklace in the box, kept in her bedroom drawer, as if it were already pulsing before she even touched it. It was impossible to forget the rules. They seemed to float in the air, written in invisible letters, watching her every step. One afternoon, while changing the flowers in the hall, he noticed that the woman's portrait, the same one that watched over the dining room, had been slightly rotated, as if someone had moved it and hastily replaced it. He approached. Between the frame and the canvas, he found a tiny folded fragment of paper. It was an old yellowed newspaper clipping with a photo of a young woman wearing the same necklace. The caption read, "Missing for 6 months, last seen at Winslow Mansion." The date was decades old. The face was eerily similar to his own. Her heart raced. She folded the paper and hid it in her apron pocket before Mrs. Doyle appeared, as always, at just the right moment to remind her. "It's almost time, dear." The housekeeper spoke softly with that tone of someone who understands more than she can say. When she fastened the necklace that night, she noticed that the rubies were colder than usual, almost icy like river stone. Dinner proceeded at the same slow pace, with short sentences and long silences. But something changed. Each time he glanced away from the portrait, he felt the woman's expression grow more severe, as if approving or disapproving of something she didn't yet understand. A slight shiver ran up the back of his neck. When, as he lowered his head to drink water, he felt a barely perceptible touch on his chain, and the millionaire had his hands on the table. After dinner, while he took a phone call in his office, she ventured to the door that always remained closed in the back hallway. She didn't know why she did it. She just felt the necklace pulling her there like a magnet. As she put her hand on the doorknob, she heard footsteps approaching. She stepped back in time to see Mrs. Doyle emerge with a basket of linens, but the look she received was clear. Don't go there. That night she was slow to fall asleep. She stared at the necklace on her bedside table, its red glow reflecting in the dim light. She thought about the debts paid, the promise fulfilled, but also about the strange sensation that each night something of her was left behind, replaced by a shadow that wasn't hers. The newspaper clipping burned in the pocket of her hanging apron, like a secret demanding to be read again. Closing her eyes, she swore she heard a whisper, not from the hallway nor from downstairs, but from the necklace itself, a barely audible word repeated slowly, as if testing her patience. The same word she would see engraved on the back of another object before the end. The following days brought a sharper cold and a glass sky that made the mansion seem even taller, as if the hill wanted to keep its secret from the rest of the United States. She began to hear the hands of the hall clock as if they were footsteps coming from a time other than her own, and the necklace, even locked in the drawer, seemed to radiate a subtle presence, a vibration that insinuated itself through the hallways before 8. It wasn't fatigue, it was a vigil. She cleaned, cooked, organized, but her body remained alert for a call that didn't always come from a human voice. Sometimes it was an ancient scent of talcum powder and roses, sometimes a wisp of melody reminiscent of a piano, sometimes nothing, and that nothing weighed more than any sound. On Wednesday afternoon, while wiping the picture frame, he noticed the canvas had a loose inner edge, as if someone had tampered with it many, many times. He pried it open with his fingernail and found, hidden between the wood and the canvas, a tiny, rusty button. He didn't press it. The reflection of the ruby in the painting, even though it wasn't around his neck, caught his eye with the lucidity of a warning. He tucked the discovery away in the same place he kept the newspaper clipping, not in his pocket but behind his heart, in the part that reminds us involuntarily. That evening, when the clock struck 8 with its bronze authority, the cold chain clung to her collarbone, and she entered the room. The table seemed larger, the linen whiter, the silver more aggressive. He spoke of an auction in Boston, of investments and a foundation with his surname engraved on the facade. Winslow, always Winslow, and never of the woman in the painting. When she risked mentioning the date engraved on the clasp, he looked up with sharp calm, saying it was a goldsmith's mark. It wasn't, she knew. So did he. Over the second course, he mentioned that he might be entertaining 2 gentlemen from the West Coast that weekend, and that he desired absolute decorum. The word settled like dust. He added, without looking at her, that there were additional clauses attached to the contract, protective measures in case of a breach of the agreement. The sentence came out, smooth and polished, but beneath it was rust. The company that had paid off his mother's debts could, if provoked, reverse donations, dispute payments, demand letters, delay treatments. He didn't threaten, he explained, and the explanation hurt more than a threat because it was aseptic. As midnight approached, the house seemed to hold its breath. He rose, thanked her for coming, always those words, and left her alone with the portrait and the dying candles. She didn't remove the necklace. Immediately. She studied the clasp carefully as if reading a map, 1211 engraved in worn steel. She remembered the first time she saw her name written in beautiful script on a faded certificate, and the date below, the same combination. She opened the window to let the cold air restore her clarity, and for a moment considered breaking the only rule that seemed human, allowing tears. Her eye ached, the muscle gave way, the water rose. She drew back her head, swallowed hard, transformed the tear into invisible salt. The contract remained intact. Back in the back hallway, the forbidden door exuded a different chill, not the chill of autumn, but the chill of a place where air is cut off. She pressed her ear to the wood and thought she heard a soft scrape, like fabric against fabric. Her name whispered from within, soundless yet clear. She turned the knob. Locked. When she stepped back, she found Mrs. Doyle face to face. The housekeeper's kind eyes were moist, but her voice was firm. Some doors are like promises. If you force them, they become curses. The phrase, spoken by someone folding sheets with saintly fingers, didn't sound like a metaphor. It sounded like experience. In the bedroom, he laid the necklace on the sheet and summoned the courage to examine the clasp. There was a nearly invisible groove, a notch hidden from the naked eye. With the tip of a staple, he pressed the metal. A click, as quiet as a sigh, opened, and a small piece of paper, no bigger than a fingernail, slipped into his palm. 2 letters and a dash. E.W. And beside it the same date, repeated. Evelyn Winslow, he thought. As if deciphering a name the house was slowly spelling out. The hypothesis hit her with the weight of an inevitable revelation. It wasn't just a likeness in the portrait. There was a mold, an outline someone was trying to fill in again. At the next dinner, the wine seemed darker. He examined the necklace with the technical interest of a museum curator and asked, almost casually, if she had cried. She denied it. He nodded, satisfied, like someone checking the condition of an expensive piece. The word piece ached like a hollow tooth. When the clock struck 11:59, she made a decision she told no one. That night, she would keep the necklace on for 11 minutes past midnight. A small, almost invisible disobedience, but enough to open a crack in a pact that had never been hers. And far down the corridor, the forbidden door seemed to listen. That night, as the hand passed midnight and inched toward the 11 minutes she had promised herself, something in the mansion changed temperature. It wasn't the air, it was the silence. A silence so thick it seemed to absorb even the sound of her own heartbeat. She sat on the edge of the bed, her necklace feeling cold as a ring of ice against her warm skin. The central ruby reflected a brighter glow, as if the moonlight, filtering through the curtain, had found a metal there hungry for attention. 7 minutes, he noticed a distant, almost imperceptible sound. A soft creak coming from the back hallway. It wasn't wood giving way, nor was it wind. It was slower, more human, like the sound of someone cautiously turning a doorknob. She didn't breathe. She remained still, as if stillness could deceive whatever was there. After 10 minutes, the sound stopped. She almost thought she imagined it, until a second sound, closer, broke the air. 3 light-spaced taps against the bedroom door. She didn't dare respond. She just listened. And then came a whisper. Not a name, but a call, deep, drawn out, as if spoken underwater. The necklace suddenly seemed to warm against her skin, a heat that didn't come from her body. He felt the urge to rip it off, but he knew that breaking the zipper was breaking a rule greater than all those written in the contract. When the clock struck 11, the sound faded. The heat disappeared. The house returned to its normal air. But she knew something had seen or felt that act. She carefully removed the necklace and placed it back in the box with the delicacy of someone putting away a loaded gun. The next morning, when she went down to the kitchen, she found a white envelope on the table, sealed with red wax. Inside, a handwritten note: "Do not repeat." No signature, no explicit threat. Just the order, dry, filling the entire space. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, the same as she had smelled in the back hallway. At dinner that night, the Millionaire didn't talk about wine, investments, or visits. He talked about discipline. "Life is made of boundaries," he said, cutting with the precision of a surgeon. "Whoever crosses a line, no matter how small, learns that every line is the same." She listened without responding, feeling the necklace as a conscious weight, as if the rubies were listening to the conversation. And in the portrait opposite, the woman's expression seemed, for the first time, almost to smile. A lopsided smile, which could have been either approval or irony. Later, in her bedroom, she removed the newspaper clipping and the small piece of paper with the initials EW and the date from their hiding place. She spread them out on the bed, studying every detail. She was trying to connect the pieces, but there were gaps that could only be filled in the closed room, and she began to wonder if the necklace's absurd condition wasn't actually a preparation, a way to mold her into something that didn't yet have a clear form but was close. In the early morning, she awoke to the sensation of someone standing beside her bed. There was no sound, just a shadow silhouetted against the pale moonlight. When she blinked, the shadow moved to the corner, then vanished. The necklace, still in its box, lay open, as if someone had tampered with it. And in that instant, she understood that time was against her, and that each night of performing the ritual did not remove her from danger, but led her right to the center of it. The next day, the mansion felt more alive, but not in a good way. The windows let in an insistent wind that ran through the hallways as if searching for someone, and each door creaked more sharply, as if opening and closing just to be heard. She worked in silence, but felt that with every step she was being watched not just by her boss, but by something moving without a body. As she passed through the hall, she noticed that the portrait wasn't quite as it had been before. Now the frame reflected a warmer light, as if the woman inside had taken an invisible step forward. At lunchtime, she found Mrs. Doyle folding towels in the laundry room. For the first time, the housekeeper spoke without looking down. "It's not the necklace you should fear. It's what it awakens." Before she could ask, the woman gathered up the towels and left, leaving a faint scent of lavender in the air, the same scent as the "do not repeat" note. That afternoon, curiosity overcame fear. He returned to the frame with the hidden button and this time pressed it. A sharp click echoed, and the bottom of the frame swung open like a small door. Inside, a wooden compartment held a black and white photograph. It was the woman in the portrait, but without the necklace. Beside her was a young man, much younger than the millionaire now, and holding the woman's hand, a child of about 5. The detail that chilled her blood was the girl's face. Unmistakable features, the same arch of her eyebrows, the same shape of her chin. It was as if she were looking at a childlike version of herself. His head throbbed. It couldn't be a coincidence. He pocketed the photo and finished his shift with the same neutral expression as always, but inside everything burned. That night, dinner was even more silently measured. The millionaire seemed to observe her more frequently, as if trying to gauge how much she already knew. At one point, he commented on the weight of invisible inheritances and how some stories repeat themselves until someone breaks them. It didn't seem like a random remark, it sounded like a pointed warning. When he went to his room, he locked the door and spread all the fragments on the bed. The newspaper clipping, the paper with the initials and date, the newly discovered photo. The connection was clear, but it remained to be understood its role in the chain, whether it was merely a physical resemblance or something deeper, more intentional. In the middle of the night, he awoke to the sound of a piano. The notes were slow, drawn out, and came from downstairs. He put on his robe and followed the sound to the music room, which always remained locked. Now the door was ajar. Inside, no one was at the piano, but the keys moved on their own, and on the bench lay the ruby necklace. The central ruby was warmer than ever, and on the clasp was a new engraving, not there before, the word, "Come back." When she touched the necklace, the music stopped, and in the silence that followed, the echo of footsteps began to climb the stairs, slow, steady, as if they were coming to fetch her. The steps ascended slowly, as if each step were chosen to provoke tension. She remained motionless, the necklace still warm in her hand, her heart racing in time with the imaginary piano notes that seemed to echo in her memory. It wasn't pure fear. It was a strange sensation of being called back to something she'd already experienced, a déjà vu that ran down her spine, when the millionaire's shadow appeared in the doorway, the hallway light casting its silhouette. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He simply looked at the necklace in her hand and said softly, "It's not time to go back." Those words swirled in her head until dawn. Back to where? Or when? As she put on her apron, she noticed that the necklace box on the nightstand was open, though she remembered closing it before leaving for the piano. There was no lock in the room that seemed secure enough. Throughout the day, she avoided crossing paths with him, but she noticed Mrs. Doyle watching her more often, as if trying to guess her thoughts. Early that afternoon, while gathering clothes upstairs, she saw the housekeeper discreetly slip an envelope under the door to the forbidden room. When she realized she was being watched, Mrs. Doyle simply said, "There are things that only survive when no one sees them." But that night, the feeling of return grew stronger. Dinner passed with almost no conversation, interrupted only by the sound of silverware and the ticking of the clock. As the last silver bell rang, he looked up and said, "If you keep going, you'll find more than answers, and answers aren't always a blessing." At 11:55, she felt a different weight on the necklace, as if it were suddenly tighter. It didn't hurt, but it pulsed in time with her heart. And then, without her doing anything, memories began to surface like flashes. The scent of lavender, different hands adjusting the chain around her neck, a feminine laugh echoing in the dining room, the sight of the same mansion but with furniture and walls in a different shade, as if she had been transported to an earlier time. When the clock struck midnight, the tightness disappeared, but the feeling of dislocation remained. Removing the necklace, she noticed the rubies were damp, as if they had absorbed something other than sweat. She touched them and felt a chill. It wasn't water, but thicker, almost like tears. Determined. To understand what come back meant, she waited until the complete silence of dawn and made her way to the forbidden door. The cold coming from there was more intense, almost biting, as if a winter were trapped behind the wood. Touching the handle, she realized it was no longer locked. She pushed slowly, and the door gave way with a creak that sounded like a warning. The room was untouched, but everything seemed to belong to another life. The perfume in the air, the dressing table covered in a veil of dust, the silk dress hanging behind the door. In the center of the bed above the sheet was a gilded portrait of herself wearing the necklace, but the expression wasn't hers. The look in the photo held something ancient, a pain and a promise he couldn't remember making. It was then that, in an almost imperceptible whisper, the same voice he had heard before repeated, this time more firmly, "Come back." And this time it no longer sounded like a request. It was an order. The word echoed within her long after the sound had faded. Come back. It was no longer just a voice, it was a presence, a weight that nestled in the back of her mind, silent but constant. The forbidden room had a heavy air, saturated with memories that didn't belong to her, and yet every detail seemed to recognize her. The silk dress with frayed seams just above her waist, the stained mirror which returned her reflection with a subtle delay, as if it needed to search for the image in another time. The dressing table with an empty jewelry box, clearly shaped for the necklace now hanging around her neck. She closed the door carefully and left, but the cold clung to her skin. The hallway seemed narrower, and with each step she felt the floor sink slightly, as if trying to hold her back. When she reached her room, she found the necklace box on the floor, open, as if it had been dropped. But she didn't remember taking it with her. The central ruby reflected the dim light in a different, almost organic way, as if something were breathing inside. The next morning, the millionaire was quieter than usual. He sat at the head of the breakfast table and, without looking directly at her, said, "Some places and some jewels belong not to those who wear them, but to those who can bear them." The sentence fell like a riddle, and she had the feeling he knew exactly where she had been the night before. Mrs. Doyle, who was serving the coffee, kept her eyes lowered, but her grip on the pot betrayed tension. Throughout the day, each task seemed to drag on. The mansion grew darker, as if the curtains were purposefully filtering the light. In the afternoon, as she passed through the upstairs hallway, she heard footsteps coming in the opposite direction. She braced herself for the sight of the millionaire, but when the figure appeared around the bend, it wasn't him. It was a woman in an antique dress, pale skin, hair pinned back, walking with a rigid posture. Around her neck was a necklace, identical to her own, and her eyes were hers. Before she could react, the woman passed her without touching her, dissolving into the air like smoke. At dinner, she couldn't touch her food. The necklace felt heavier than ever, pulling her forward, as if trying to drag her toward the portrait on the wall. The millionaire broke the silence only to say, "When you're called, you don't refuse. You know that, don't you?" She didn't answer. She was focused on the strange sensation that was growing. A sudden urge to cross the hallway and return to the forbidden room, even with him sitting just a few feet away. That night, she resisted as long as she could. But when the clock struck 2 in the morning, she was up, crossing the hallway toward the door. She found it ajar, as if waiting for her. Inside, the cold was even more intense, and on the bed now lay 2 objects, the portrait of her face and the silk dress spread out, smooth, as if freshly ironed. On the dress was a note in delicate handwriting. "Get dressed. It's time to go back." The voice now didn't come as a whisper. It came like wind, passing through her ears, filling the room with a single command she could no longer refuse. The necklace suddenly warmed, as if confirming the order, and she knew she was no longer just a guest in this story. She was at the center of whatever the final arrangement was. She stared at the dress for a few seconds, as if staring at a trap, and at the same time, a key. The fabric was heavy, but soft to the touch, exuding an ancient scent of lavender and something slightly sweet like vanilla. The necklace pulsed warmly around her neck, and with each beat it seemed to synchronize with the distant sound of a piano, as if someone were playing a slow march just for her. Her fingers hesitated before touching the note again. "Get dressed. It's time to go back." There was no signature, but the delicate handwriting had the same elegance as the woman in the portrait. With trembling hands, she slipped on the silk, feeling the zipper slide easily, as if the dress were made for her or for the body she now represented. Looking at herself in the stained mirror, it took a second for her reflection to respond, and when it did, it wasn't quite her gaze. There was a weight in her eyes, a memory that wasn't hers, but which he recognized as if it were an invisible scar. The door to the forbidden room closed by itself, and the cold wind died, giving way to a silence almost liquid, dense, in which any sound would have sounded like a scream. Then a low knock echoed from the direction of the dining room. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. She descended the stairs, each step deeper, as if sinking deeper into the story she'd been resisting. The room was lit only by candles. At the table, the millionaire was waiting for her. He showed no surprise at seeing her dressed like that. He simply lifted a glass of wine, studied her from head to toe, and said, "Now I understand why she chose you." These words struck her more than any threat, because they confirmed that everything from that first night had been calculated. He didn't ask if she'd found the room or the photo or the note. He spoke as if he already knew everything. What started can't be stopped. You feel it, don't you? The nights have shaped you. The necklace recognizes you. And when the time comes, there will be no difference between you and her. Halfway through dinner, he heard footsteps in the hallway. They weren't Mrs. Doyle's. The female figure slipped through the half-open door and entered the room, wearing an outfit identical to his, except for the necklace, which shone with an even brighter ruby. The woman approached, and for a moment, the two stood side by side. The millionaire didn't react, as if her presence were part of the ceremony. The woman touched the necklace around her neck and whispered, "This is how you repay a debt." The nearest candle went out, and in the momentary darkness, she felt her necklace tighten slightly, almost suffocating her before relaxing again. When the light returned, the woman had disappeared. The millionaire finished his wine, placed the glass on the table, and said, "When the time comes, don't fight. That's how you preserve what's worth it." Back in her room, she found the mirror fogged up, even though no window was open. As she approached, she noticed that her reflection didn't immediately follow her movements. The image smiled discreetly, and only then followed her, as if something or someone were watching from within. And deep down, an uncomfortable certainty formed. The comeback wasn't just a call to play a role, it was a call to give up one's place entirely. Dawn arrived with a different weight, as if the mansion had slipped deeper into a time beyond the calendar. The wind that had previously slid through the cracks was now still, dense, almost warm, like the breath of someone very close. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sound of a glass being placed on a table, the scraping of a chair, a light tap on the strings of a distant piano. These weren't random noises, they were echoes of past dinners, repeating themselves to remind her that history was still unfolding. Around 3, a sharp crack echoed from the forbidden room. She stood, her silk dress still draped over the chair, and the necklace on the nightstand, open as if prepared for her. When she touched it, the central ruby burned slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to scar the skin for a few seconds. As she put on the necklace, the silence broke into 2 slow piano beats, followed by a single whisper. "Now." Following the voice, she descended the stairs. The dining room was lit by candles she couldn't remember lighting. The table was set, but not for 2, for 3. In the centerpiece, a crystal goblet stood untouched, and before it, an empty chair waited. The millionaire was already there, watching her with a mixture of approval and expectation. "Today you're not a guest, you're a hostess," he said, gesturing for her to sit at the head. He obeyed, but it felt like he was occupying a place that didn't belong to him. The candles flickered gently, though there was no draught. He didn't talk about business or rules. He spoke of continuity, about how certain presences don't fade, they just change hosts. "You feel the house as she did," he said. "The necklace only accelerates what was already within you." The door to the room opened by itself, and the female figure entered, wearing the same outfit but with the original necklace, the one that seemed to have belonged to the first woman. She sat to her right, not looking directly at her. The millionaire raised his glass, toasting something he didn't say aloud, and drank. Then they both heard the same command, this time not whispered but firm, like a sentence. "Switch." The necklace tightened around her neck like a tight noose, and the chain seemed to move on its own. When she blinked, the room changed slightly. The furniture darker, the air heavier, the candlelight more yellow. And where the millionaire should have been, she saw his younger self, watching her as if recognizing the reunion of something lost. The woman on her right smiled, stood, and effortlessly removed her necklace, replacing it with her own. At the touch of the cold metal, a shiver ran down her spine, and the vision of the young millionaire dissolved, returning her to the original table. But now it was she who wore the old necklace. The weight was different, almost suffocating. It wasn't just gold and rubies. It was the sensation of carrying years of silence, of rituals, of endless nights gazing at the portrait that now seemed even more alive. He smiled with satisfaction and said, "Now you understand." When she returned to her room, she realized the mirror no longer reflected just her image. In the reflection, in the background, the original woman stood, watching her. And this time, when she turned, there was no one there. Only the ruby, beating like a heart that wasn't hers. He woke late, as if his body had been used by someone else during the night. He went straight to the washroom and found the automatic gesture with which he tied his hair strange. It wasn't his style, it was a low, firm, precise bun, something his fingers had never learned. When he lifted his face, the mirror showed for a moment an angle he didn't recognize, a tilt of the chin, a purse of the lips, and then, immediately after, his usual expression, startled by his own normality. The necklace, now his old one, bit into his skin with small rhythmic pressures, as if giving discreet commands. In the hallway, the morning light didn't penetrate completely. It seemed to break into golden dust before touching the floor, and every speck of dust seemed to watch. He went down to the kitchen and, without thinking, opened the drawer he never touched. He took out a leather-bound notebook and leafed through it halfway, as if he knew exactly where the secret lay. Slanted, elegant letters, ancient dates. November 12th. Her hand began to write over it, almost without permission. I return because they call me. I stay because they look at me. He recognized his own handwriting, folding it until it matched Evelyn's. When she realized what she was doing, she recoiled, her heart pounding, and the scent of lavender grew stronger, invading the edges of her consciousness. That afternoon she prepared tea as usual, but added honey and lemon in the exact proportions she never used, and placed the cup on the silver tray without looking. When she entered the office, he looked up and froze. Not because of the tea, because of the gesture, because of the way she set down the tray, because of the way she inclined her head before taking 2 steps back, because of the 3-second pause before closing the door. A choreography that cannot be learned, it repeats itself. "You're remembering," he said almost in a whisper, and there was no triumph there. There was fear masked by control. By the end of the day, the entire house seemed to have memorized her footsteps. The floor didn't creak under her feet, as if recognizing her weight. The hall clock moved forward a minute, or was it she who had slowed it down inside herself? On the stairs, he stopped mid-step because he felt a gentle tug on the chain, an invitation. The forbidden door was ajar, and the room this time wasn't cold. It was warm. The mirror returned a 2-second delayed reflection, and when it finally caught up with her, it revealed a detail that left her speechless. A small oval mark on her left collarbone, something she'd never had, but the woman in the portrait had. He put his hand to the spot and felt the sensitive skin, as if the memory weighed down with flesh. Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway, her eyes moist. She held a faded cream-colored envelope, its seal broken. "Decades ago. I kept it as long as I could," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't want you to know you were wanted." Inside, a letterhead from a rural orphanage, noting the delivery of a girl on November 12th, filiation not recognized, signed by a woman who couldn't attend the ceremony. At the bottom, 3 letters that time had nearly erased. E.W. The date was also hers. History drew in one stroke the missing outline. Evelyn, the wife, the daughter, invisible, the man, guardian of silence, the mansion, altar of the pact, and now the necklace closing the circle, summoning blood to take the place of blood. When the 8 o'clock bell rang, her body was already moving in a learned rhythm. At the table, she sat at the head of the table without being told to, as she had the night before. He watched, his fingers gripping the cutlery too tightly. "You understand why you can't cry," he said, not looking directly. "Water undoes what the ruby's fire holds together." She heard and felt deep down the cruel logic. Tears washed away the varnish of the portrait, stripped the paint from the myth, dissolved the pact that held it together. The necklace had been the garland and the gag. Now it was the chain that demanded continuation. Between one course and another, the feminine presence crossed the room like a breeze, stopping behind his chair. The candle flickered, the wine swayed. She, the one in the portrait, placed a thin hand on the man's shoulder and then touched the back of the young woman's neck. A thin warmth ran down her spine, and 2 memories overlapped. The child isolated in the hallway of a nursing home, the woman alone before the mirror, fastening the necklace with firm fingers. An invisible thread connected the 3, and when the presence retreated, the thread didn't break. It tightened. After dinner, he didn't dismiss her as he had on other days. He asked her to accompany him to his office. From the safe, he took out a folder with contracts, donation, receipts and transfers from one foundation to another. He placed everything on the table like someone displaying a trophy and confessed without saying a word. He had bought silence, fertilized the memory with charity, preserved the portrait with paint and secrecy. "The house needs occupied seats, not ghosts," he murmured. And she understood his fear. It wasn't of losing his wife. It was of losing the version of himself that this mourning justified. She returned to the room carrying the briefcase, the envelope from the orphanage, and the necklace burning low like embers. The mirror was waiting for her. When she approached, the reflection didn't delay, it went ahead. The image did first what, a second later, the body would do. She reached for the clasp, but the figure in the mirror stopped her, holding her hand in mid-air, and she felt the touch, warm, solid, impossible. It wasn't possession. It was a request. It was a legacy. "I don't want to take you," the presence molded on her. Lips, soundless. "I want to be wept over." And in that instant, the prohibition that had always sounded absurd revealed its ultimate cruelty. Denying water to those who can only be freed by water. She smiled, a smile not of surrender, but of purpose. Karma, finally, had a shape and a price. And as the clock ticked toward the next night, she knew exactly what she would do when the candles burned again and the wine darkened in the crystal. She would let the first tear fall upon the ruby, and let what was trapped finally learn to swim. The following night began earlier, not because of the time on the clock, but because of the way the mansion behaved. The curtains swayed in a wind that didn't come from outside. The walls seemed to vibrate, as if awaiting something inevitable. She spent the entire day wearing the necklace around her neck, defying the rule, and noticed that the ruby's temperature changed according to her thoughts. Warm when she remembered the woman in the portrait. Cool when she thought of the millionaire. Sometimes it pulsed in time with her heart, as if trying to synchronize with her life and absorb it completely. At 7:50, she came downstairs. She wasn't wearing her silk dress. This time, she opted for a simple maid's uniform, as if refusing to play a forced role. When she entered the dining room, the millionaire was already at the table, but his look wasn't just expectant. It was irritated. "Tonight's the last night," he said bluntly. "Tomorrow, everything will be in place." She didn't ask what he meant by that. She simply sat down, keeping her hands on the table, as ritual always dictated, but with her fingers deliberately slightly damp. Mrs. Doyle poured the wine with measured steps, but her fixed gaze on the young woman said more than any words. As she placed the plate before her, she let out a quick, almost inaudible whisper. "If I'm going to do it, let it be now." She didn't answer, but she felt the pulse in her necklace quicken, as if she had heard it. Dinner passed in tense silence. With each clink of silverware, the air seemed to thicken. At 11:40, the female figure appeared, walking slowly down the hallway, her antique dress brushing the floor. He didn't enter through the door as before. This time he passed through the wood like smoke. The millionaire closed his eyes for a moment, as if enduring an ancient pain. When he opened them, he said to the young woman, "See? That's what the necklace is for. To keep. What belongs in place. To keep her from dissolving." The woman in the portrait stopped behind her and touched her shoulders. The touch was neither cold nor warm, but carried the weight of decades of waiting. The voice sounded clear, almost human. "End this." The millionaire slammed his fist on the table, the dry sound cutting through the air. "She won't cry," he said, as if delivering a verdict. "I chose her because she knows how to hold back." The tension became almost physical. The ruby burned, and the chain felt tighter around her neck. The woman leaned close to her face and whispered, very close, "Remember who you were before you were shaped." The air smelled of lavender and melted candle, and every detail in the room seemed to want to trap her in the moment. But the decision had already been made. At 11:59, she looked up at the portrait. The woman inside returned her gaze with a mixture of pleading and strength. The millionaire remained motionless, his fingers clenching the crystal goblet, and then, as if carrying out a silent sentence, she let the memory of the abandoned child in the orphanage meet the woman imprisoned in the painting. Emotion rose in her throat, choked her breath, and burned in her eyes. The first tear escaped, sliding slowly down her cheek until it fell on the central ruby. The sound wasn't of water touching stone, it was of glass, cracking. A thin fissure spread across the gem, and the warmth suddenly disappeared, replaced by a biting cold. The millionaire jumped to his feet but didn't touch her. The woman in the portrait recoiled, smiling for the first time without irony. The second tear fell before he could say another word, and the ruby split in two, releasing a breath of air so ancient it blew out all the candles in the room at once. The burst of air blew out the candles and left the mansion blind, but not silent. From the end of the hallway, the piano played 3 notes that seemed to come from underwater, and then everything went still, as if the house held its breath to hear what came next. The broken ruby glowed in the darkness like a dying ember. The millionaire took a step, his hand poised over the table, but he didn't dare touch it. "What have you done?" he asked, and the question came without authority, only with fear. The woman in the portrait was no longer a shadow. She stood clearly between them, her face turned toward the young woman. She didn't smile. She rested an invisible hand on the chain and, with a slow gesture, loosened the metal that for weeks had been crown and shackle. Her skin breathed as if emerging from water. Then, where the ruby had split open, 2 red drops slid and rested on the linen, not like a stone, but like a condensed tear, ancient blood finally finding its way out. He tried to relight the candles with trembling fingers, but the matches went out before a flame could emerge, as if the air in the room had learned to say no. "You don't understand," he murmured. "I kept her here so she wouldn't disappear, so the house wouldn't turn to dust." And what was implied between the words was harsher than any confession. To keep her own version of herself alive, she had consigned a child to oblivion and summoned other women to carry the necklace as if they were a surrogate body. She didn't cry anymore. She didn't need to. What the house needed now was to hear the truth out loud. He picked up the envelope from the orphanage and placed it beside the crimson shards. He spoke his own name in full, followed by the date engraved on the seal. He added the initials E.W. with the firmness of someone finally reading a complete epitaph. Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway and stood, silent, like a witness to an oath she had waited decades for. "You chose silence because silence absolved you," the young woman said, without raising her voice. "But silence is also a knife." He took a half-step forward, the mask of control giving way, and something he had never allowed himself to see shone in his eyes. Water. The man's first tear fell onto one of the fragments and, instead of extinguishing it, ignited a harsh, almost cruel glow that ran across the broken glass like a red-hot copper wire. The portrait on the wall cracked. The frame seemed to expand a millimeter, and in the glass there was no longer just the woman. There was his reflection, slightly displaced, as if searching for a place to fit. The feminine presence finally spoke, not to the daughter but to the man. "Come back." The word which for months had demanded the young woman take the dead woman's place now pointed to the only one who had never sat where he should, the one in charge. He stepped back, but the living room floor, the silent accomplice of so many dinners, pushed him forward with a low creak. With each step, the hallway clock advanced a second. The house was in a hurry. When his shadow touched the base of the wall, the glass of the portrait trembled, and a film of moisture rose from the ancient oil, as if the painting might finally weep. The woman's image gave way, and his reflection, drawn in by a windless wind, settled in the depths of the painting. It wasn't violence, it was fitting. Outside he still breathed, 2-3 short movements, and then his body remained motionless, standing before the wall, as if he understood too late the true rule. The necklace didn't bind women, it bound guilt. The candles relit themselves. The air lost its scent of lavender and gained the freshness of an open window after a storm. The chain fell from the young woman's neck with a small sound, of metal fulfilling destiny and falling silent, and the remaining ruby half dissolved into color, staining the white fabric pale red, not like a wound, but like a seal. In the hallway, the piano played a final note and fell silent. Mrs. Doyle approached, her eyes shining with relief and grief, and called the young woman by the surname she had never dared use. "Miss Winslow." He handed her a short, heavy key, the iron worn from many turns in ancient locks. "She asked me to keep it until you mourned for both of them." The next morning, the house had a different sound. The boards, once resentful, accepted light footsteps. The clock had returned to the correct time. The portrait, now with two presences, had lost its menace and gained penance. The man, staring into the oil, had a wet reflection in his eyes that would not dry. At 8 o'clock, for the first time, no one ate dinner. The living room remained lit but empty. The young woman crossed the hall and opened the door to the forbidden room. The old chill was gone, leaving the clean, simple air of an aired bedroom. On the dressing table, the empty jewelry box waited not for the necklace but for the black and white photograph. She placed her there, the child's face turned to the light, and heard a contented sigh behind her. She didn't turn. She simply said, "Mom," and the floor of the house thanked her wordlessly. Days later, at the county clerk's office on state letterhead, she read with steady hands the letter Evelyn had left, rescued from the compartment behind the portrait, along with the key, acknowledging her daughter and granting, not her fortune, but the right to complete the process, sell the mansion, donate the pieces from the collection to a local museum in Boston, transform the foundation into a refuge for women whose names have been erased by some history. She signed, without trembling. As she left, the late afternoon light painted the brick facades with a small-town American gold, and for the first time, the world outside the hill seemed to fit within her body. On their last visit to the house before the sale, he had run his hand over the frame. The portrait still held the man, now pale as the very idea of control. She leaned her forehead against the glass for a second, not out of pity but for closure, and whispered what he never said, "Thank you for teaching me otherwise." In the garden, the first drops of rain began to fall. She let them wet what remained of the red shards on the earth. The water dissolved the last sparkle, and where the ruby touched the ground, a fragile stain lit like a seed. There was no music, no command, no promise, only the certainty that, in that house in the United States where money tried to tame mourning, the inheritance had finally changed address, from the portrait to the world, from silence to voice, from the absurd condition to the freedom to weep. And when she closed the iron gate, the mansion didn't protest. It breathed a sigh of relief, like someone who, after decades, finally learns to sleep. If this story touched you, get ready. The next video will open a door you might never want to close. Like now, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. Because when this new story begins, you'll want to be here for every second.